They demoted me on a Tuesday like it was a weather update. No warning, no performance plan, just Jason sliding a one-page letter across the conference table and smiling like he'd finally solved a problem. Sarah from HR sat beside him, hands folded, eyes already avoiding mine. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked one question. Can you email me the HR documentation that supports this decision? The room went quiet in a way I've only heard when someone realizes they've put something in writing they can't take back. I'm Kevin Thompson, 48 years old, Senior Quality Assurance Manager at Parker Manufacturing in Dallas. We make automotive parts for the Big Three. I've been doing this work for 12 years, 6 of them here. Ex-Navy, divorced, 2 grown kids. I show up early, check safety protocols twice, and go home knowing nobody gets hurt because I cut corners. The meeting invite had been vague. Quick sync, 10 minutes. When I walked into that small conference room, Jason was already there with Sarah. No laptop, no agenda, just a printed letter face down on the table. That was my first red flag. Jason started talking before I sat down. He used words like perception, alignment, and communication style. He said I was technically strong but difficult to work with. Said my approach created friction with leadership. Never mentioned a missed deadline, failed inspection, or the 0 safety incidents on my watch for 3 years. Just vibes. Then he flipped that letter over and slid it toward me. Effective immediately, I was being moved from Senior QA Manager to QA Specialist. Same department, same workload, but $18,000 less per year and no authority over safety protocols. Temporary, he added, if you show improvement. I read the letter twice. It referenced ongoing concerns raised by leadership, but didn't list a single example. No dates, no incidents, no specifics. It talked about company values without saying how I'd violated them. I felt my pulse in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. Is this considered disciplinary action? I asked. Sarah said it was a developmental step. Is there a performance improvement plan? Not at this time. What specific behaviors do I need to change? Jason leaned back. It's more about how you show up, Kevin. That's when I understood something important. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted compliance. So I didn't give them a fight. I asked for documentation. See, this hadn't come out of nowhere. Jason and I had been clashing for months, quietly. No shouting matches, just disagreements. He liked fast decisions and quick turnarounds. I liked proper testing and written procedures. When he pushed to ship a batch of brake components without completing the full 72-hour stress testing, I flagged the liability risk. When he wanted me to sign off on a production schedule that violated OSHA guidelines, I said no, politely, in writing. The breaking point came 3 weeks earlier. Jason had blamed my team for a delay that wasn't ours. I corrected him in a meeting with a timeline pulled straight from our quality control database. He laughed it off in the room, but later that day, he messaged me saying I'd undermined his authority. I replied that accuracy wasn't undermining, it was part of my job. After that, the tone changed. Fewer check-ins, shorter responses, feedback that felt more like mood than substance. I started documenting everything carefully, old Navy habit. By the end of that Tuesday, the shock wore off and clarity settled in. This wasn't about my attitude, it was about control. Jason was 35, fresh MBA, and Nicholas Parker's son, our CEO. He'd been groomed for leadership but never worked a factory floor, never seen what happens when you rush safety protocols. That evening, I forwarded the demotion letter to my personal email. I pulled my last 3 performance reviews, all exceeding expectations. I saved screenshots of safety certifications, OSHA compliance records, and emails where leadership had thanked me for catching problems before they became disasters. I didn't rant or post anything online, I just organized. Sarah emailed 2 days later, polite and vague. They'd compile available documentation and get back to me soon. No specific timeline. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a quick process. But I also knew something else. If they were confident in their case, they would have sent it already. HR didn't reply for 5 days. By day 6, Jason was acting like nothing had happened. Same casual check-ins, same requests for input on decisions I used to own. Same work, less authority, less pay. I said yes because saying no would have been framed as proof of my attitude problem. On day 7, Sarah finally emailed. Short message, 2 paragraphs. She attached a single PDF titled Performance Summary. It wasn't a report. It wasn't an investigation. It was a loose collection of bullet points written in passive voice. Perceived resistance to leadership direction. Communication style described as inflexible. Questions. Decisions in group settings. Approach conflicts with company pace. No dates, no names, no examples. No reference to safety standards or regulatory compliance. No mention that questioning decisions had prevented 2 potential recalls and saved the company $400,000 in liability costs last year. I read it 3 times. The wording mattered. Described as, not documented as, perceived, not observed. This wasn't evidence, it was interpretation. So I replied carefully. I thanked them for sending it. I asked where this summary was stored in my personnel file. I asked which leaders had contributed to it and when these concerns had first been raised. I asked why none of this appeared in my performance reviews or safety evaluations. I cited the company policy that said disciplinary actions had to be supported by documented coaching or progressive discipline. I CC'd myself. I didn't CC a lawyer, not yet. Sarah responded the next morning with a different tone, warmer, softer. She said the summary was informal feedback that reflected ongoing conversations. She said, not everything needed to rise to the level of formal documentation. That sentence told me everything. If it was informal, it shouldn't justify a demotion. If it justified a demotion, it couldn't be informal. So I pushed one step further. I requested my complete personnel file, including internal notes, manager submissions, and safety-related documentation. I referenced Texas law and company policy. I kept it neutral, professional, boring. Jason messaged me an hour later. First direct contact since the meeting. Hey Kevin, just saw the email thread. I feel like this is getting adversarial. That wasn't my intention. I stared at that message for a long time. I replied that I was trying to understand the basis for a decision that affected my role and pay. I said transparency would help rebuild trust. He didn't respond. Over the next week, little things started happening. Meetings I used to attend weren't on my calendar. Safety decisions were made without my input, then handed to me to implement. Ryan Rodriguez, a guy I'd worked with for 4 years, pulled me aside quietly. No drama, he said. But Jason's been saying you're hard to manage, says you push back too much. I asked if he'd ever seen me being disrespectful. He shook his head. Always seemed reasonable to me. You know your stuff. That night, I went back through my emails. Everything. I built a timeline of when feedback appeared and when it didn't, when Jason's tone shifted, when safety responsibilities were reassigned, when I'd refused to sign off on questionable decisions that later caused problems. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about attitude, it was about friction. I slowed things down when they needed slowing. I asked for documentation when lives were on the line. Jason hated that. HR finally sent my personnel file 9 days after my request. It was thick. Offer letters, performance reviews, safety certificates, commendation letters from corporate headquarters. Buried near the back was a manager submission dated 2 weeks before my demotion. Jason had written that I was resistant to operational efficiency initiatives and struggled with adapting to evolving leadership expectations. He recommended a temporary adjustment of responsibilities to reset dynamics. No mention of my safety record. No mention of the $400,000 I'd saved the company. No mention that I'd never been coached or warned. What caught my eye wasn't what he wrote. It was what wasn't there. No HR acknowledgement. No investigation. No evidence anyone had validated his claims. They demoted me based on one manager's opinion. And now it was in writing. I didn't react right away. I sat with it because once you realize the system is paper thin, the smartest move isn't anger, it's precision. I didn't go to HR the next morning. Instead, I researched. I pulled OSHA regulations on retaliation for safety concerns. I reviewed company policies on progressive discipline. I documented every safety issue I'd flagged in the past year. The pattern was clear. When I'd pushed back on rushed decisions, problems followed. When leadership listened, we avoided them. I had emails proving it. A few days later, Sarah scheduled a check-in. The conversation was friendly, almost casual. She asked how I was adjusting, whether the role felt clear, whether I had concerns about Jason. I said I was doing the work. I said I understood the expectations. Then I asked a question that changed everything. How does the company typically review demotions to ensure they meet progressive discipline standards? Sarah hesitated. Not long, but long enough. She said there was a formal grievance process, rarely used. She said it might strain relationships. I told her I understood. I asked for the form. When I submitted that grievance, I wrote it chronologically. I attached performance reviews, safety certifications, emails where leadership had praised my thoroughness. I referenced specific OSHA guidelines Jason's decisions had violated. I didn't call him malicious. I called the process unsupported by company policy. The grievance form was 6 pages when I finished, each claim backed up with documentation, each timeline verified with email timestamps. I wasn't asking them to take my word for anything. 2 days later, Jason called me. First actual phone conversation since this started. He sounded calm, but there was something tight underneath. I feel blindsided by this, Kevin. I wish you'd come to me directly. I did come to you directly, multiple times. I asked for clarity, for documentation, for specific examples. Not everything needs to be a formal process. Safety does, accountability does. When you're dealing with brake components in people's lives, everything needs to be formal. Look, I think there's been some miscommunication. Maybe we can work this out without all the paperwork. That was the first crack in his confidence. He was offering to negotiate. The paperwork is already submitted, I said. Let's see where it goes. The call ended politely, but I could hear the change in his voice. This wasn't going how he'd expected. After that, things moved fast. HR stopped being vague. They started asking specific questions, dates, witnesses, documentation. They asked Jason for coaching records. He didn't have any. They asked why safety concerns hadn't been addressed through proper channels. Meanwhile, Jason started changing his behavior. He CC'd HR on messages. He documented conversations that had never been documented before. Too late. The absence of past documentation only highlighted just how urgent it was now. The most unexpected moment came when Ryan pulled me aside again a week later. He said HR had contacted him as part of their review. They asked about my work quality, my safety focus, my interactions with the team. I told them the truth. He said, "You're thorough. Company's better for having you." That sentence meant more than any vindication letter could have. I realized I hadn't been alone. I'd just been quiet. But HR wasn't stopping with Ryan. They contacted Michelle Torres from engineering, Brad Walsh from production, and Karen Stevens from corporate quality assurance. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. People respected my work. They trusted my judgment on safety issues. The difficult-to-work-with narrative wasn't matching what they were hearing. 3 weeks into the investigation, HR scheduled another meeting with me. This time, it was just Sarah and her manager, Patricia Williams. No Jason. Patricia was direct. "We're reviewing the circumstances around your role change. Can you walk us through your understanding of the events leading up to it?" I'd been preparing for this moment. I pulled out a folder with printed emails, sorted chronologically. I walked them through each interaction with Jason where safety concerns had been raised. The brake component testing, the production schedule conflicts, the timeline correction that had triggered his complaint. For each incident, I showed them the original issue, my response, and the outcome. When I'd been overruled, problems had followed. When my recommendations were followed, they hadn't. "This is comprehensive," Patricia said, flipping through the documentation. "I've always kept detailed records," I replied. Navy habit. Sarah took notes throughout the meeting. She asked specific questions about company safety policies, about my understanding of progressive discipline, about whether I felt my demotion was related to safety advocacy. That last question hung in the air for a moment. I answered carefully. "I think my role change happened after I consistently raised safety concerns that slowed down operational timelines. Whether those concerns were the direct cause or just made me inconvenient, I can't say for certain, but the timing suggests a connection. After that meeting, things started shifting in ways I could feel but couldn't quite see. Jason stopped messaging me entirely. Ryan mentioned that some of the shortcuts Jason had been pushing were quietly being reversed. The 72-hour testing protocols I'd insisted on were suddenly back in the standard procedures. 2 weeks later, HR expanded their review. They contacted former employees who'd worked under Jason. Both had left within the past 18 months. Both had cited cultural fit and communication differences in their exit interviews. Now they were being asked more specific questions. I only learned about this when Lisa Martinez, a former employee, called me directly. She'd moved to a competitor but still had friends at Parker Manufacturing. They asked me about safety protocols and whether I felt supported when raising concerns, she said. I was honest. Jason doesn't like being questioned, even when the questions are legitimate. Two more conversations like that told the same story. People who'd worked with Jason had noticed the same pattern I had. Question his decisions, get labeled as difficult. Push for proper procedures, get marginalized. HR called me back for what they said would be a final meeting. This time, Patricia had someone else with her, Dan Murphy from corporate HR. "Kevin, we've completed our review," Patricia said. "We found that your demotion didn't follow progressive discipline procedures. The documentation supporting the action was insufficient." Dan leaned forward. "We're also concerned about potential retaliation for safety advocacy, which violates company policy and federal regulations." I felt something loosen in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral and professional. "What does that mean for my situation?" "Your original role and compensation will be restored, effective immediately," Patricia said. "Your personnel file will reflect no disciplinary action. The previous documentation will be removed." She paused. "We're also restructuring some responsibilities. Jason will be transitioning to a business development role focused on client relations. He'll no longer have direct reports or involvement in operational safety decisions." That was corporate speak for exile. I understood it perfectly. "There's one more thing," Dan said. "Given your expertise and the value of your safety advocacy, we're creating a new position, Regional Safety Coordinator. It would involve oversight of safety protocols across all our manufacturing sites, with direct reporting to corporate quality assurance." The promotion was real, but it wasn't the fairy tale ending I might have expected 6 months ago. It came with new challenges. More travel, more responsibility, more politics to navigate. And it meant Jason's father, Nicholas Parker, had essentially signed off on his son's demotion. "I'd like some time to consider the coordinator position," I said, "but I appreciate having my original role restored." They agreed to give me a week to decide. Walking back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph, exactly. More like equilibrium. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Documentation had mattered. Process had mattered. Patience had mattered. Jason was nowhere to be seen that afternoon. His office was empty, computer packed up. Ryan mentioned he'd left around lunchtime with a box of personal items. That evening, I called my ex-wife to tell her about the resolution. She was glad things had worked out, but she asked a question that stayed with me. "Are you going to take the new position?" I didn't have an answer yet. At 48, starting over in a new role meant risk. But staying in the same position after everything that had happened also meant risk. Some relationships would never fully heal completely. Some trust would never be completely rebuilt. The next morning, I found an email from Nicholas Parker himself. Brief, professional. He thanked me for my professionalism throughout the process and said the company was better for having employees who prioritized safety and integrity. No mention of his son. No apology, just professional acknowledgement. It was enough. 3 days later, I decided to take the Regional Safety Coordinator position. The decision wasn't easy. At 48, I was comfortable in routines. I knew the plant, knew the people, knew where problems were. Starting fresh meant new politics, new relationships, new ways things could go wrong. But staying in the same role after everything that had happened meant complications. Some people would always wonder if I was the guy who got the boss's son fired. Others might second-guess their interactions with me. The new position offered something different, authority that came from corporate, not local management, a chance to implement safety standards across multiple facilities. And honestly, after 12 years in manufacturing, I was ready for a challenge that didn't involve factory floor politics. When I called Patricia Williams to accept, she seemed relieved. She said they'd already started briefing me on the other facilities, and my first assignment would be a comprehensive safety audit of the Memphis plant, starting in 6 weeks. That gave me time to wrap up projects and train Ryan on the protocols I'd developed. It also gave me time to watch how things played out after Jason's departure. The changes were subtle but real. Safety meetings ran longer. People asked more questions. When Brad Walsh flagged a concern about a new piece of equipment, nobody rushed to override him. The culture was shifting back to something I recognized: methodical, careful, professional. Ryan took over most of my daily responsibilities and did well with them. During one of our handover sessions, he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you think Jason knew he was wrong, or did he really believe his approach was better?" I thought about that for a moment. I think he believed speed was more important than process. And when process got in his way, he convinced himself the process was the problem. That's kind of sad, Ryan said. It is. But it's also dangerous when you're dealing with automotive parts. I never saw Jason again after that day he cleared out his office. Ryan mentioned running into him at a Dallas networking event months later, said he seemed to be doing fine working with clients instead of production teams. Part of me wondered if he'd learned anything from the difficult experience. Another part of me figured that wasn't really my concern anymore. The Memphis assignment turned out to be exactly what I needed. Different facility, different challenges, but the same core principles applied. Document everything, follow procedures, ask questions when something doesn't look right. I found myself sleeping better on the road than I had at home in months. There's something clarifying about walking into a new place where your reputation is based entirely on the work you do. 6 months into the new role, I got a call from Michelle Torres back at the Dallas plant. She'd been promoted to senior engineer and was dealing with a safety issue that reminded her of the brake component problems. "I wanted to run this by you before escalating," she said. "I've got timeline pressure from management, but the testing data doesn't look right." I walked her through the same process I'd used dozens of times. Document the concern, reference the relevant standards, present alternatives that balance safety with operational needs. "Don't make it personal." "That's exactly what I needed to hear," she said. "Thanks." After we hung up, I realized something important had changed. I wasn't the guy fighting battles anymore. I was the guy helping other people fight their battles smarter and more effectively. The regional role taught me things I hadn't expected. Different plants had different cultures, but the same basic dynamics played out everywhere. Someone pushes for shortcuts, someone else pushes back. How those conflicts get resolved determines whether people go home safe. My job became pattern recognition, spotting the Jason-type managers before they could entrench bad practices. Teaching the Ryan-type employees how to document their concerns professionally, making sure the safety system worked the way it was designed to work. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days nothing dramatic happened. But every few months, I'd get a call or an email from someone at one of the plants saying they'd prevented a problem by following protocols I'd helped establish. Those messages made the travel and the hotel rooms and the repetitive training sessions worthwhile. A year and a half into the coordinator role, corporate offered me a position in the home office, Director of Manufacturing Safety. More responsibility, better pay, less travel. I turned it down. The field work suited me. I liked seeing the actual production lines, talking to the people doing the real work, solving problems that had immediate consequences. Desk jobs are fine for some people, but after everything I'd been through, I wanted to stay close to where things mattered. My kids noticed the positive change when they visited. My daughter said I seemed more relaxed, more confident than I'd been in years. My son asked if I was planning to stay with Parker Manufacturing long term. "For now," I told him, "as long as they keep letting me do the work." Looking back, I realized the demotion was probably the best thing that could have happened to my career. Not because I enjoyed the process, nobody enjoys being called difficult for doing their job correctly, but because it forced me to understand how systems really work and how to work within them effectively. These days, when people ask me for advice about workplace conflicts, I tell them to document better, to understand policies better than the people trying to circumvent them, to remember that patience and precision beat anger and volume. Most importantly, I tell them this: if someone says your attitude is the problem when you're advocating for safety or proper procedures, that's a sign you're doing something right. The trick is proving it in a way that leaves no room for interpretation. The truth has a way of surfacing when you give it enough light and time.